In our first program, A Miracle in the Making, we explored the roots of the ecumenical movement. We concluded with the era just immediately prior to the Second Vatican Council, where the Catholic involvement in the ecumenical movement had changed from a non-existent thing to a secretive, almost ecumenical underground, and finally to official recognition and participation. So we'd like to start off this program by returning to Dr. Albert Outler, our distinguished guest from Perkins School of Theology, to ask him to continue his explanation to us of the beginnings of the Second Vatican Council in the time immediately prior to Pope John the 23rd. Dr. Outler.
Pope Pius XII had thought of a council and had mentioned it to some of the people in Rome, but it was quickly pointed out that given the basic position of the Roman Catholic Church after the First Vatican Council, that another council would have been superfluous and ineffective. When John the 23rd came, he had little or no background in the Roman Curia or the Roman situation. He'd spent his time in Bulgaria and Constantinople and France, and he knew the needs of the world better than almost anyone in Rome. He wanted to find some way of opening the Roman Church to the world and of letting the world see the Roman Catholic Church in a loving and hospitable guise. And so he began to cast about for how to do that. One of the things he did in this regard was the great encyclical Pacem in Terris, which instead of being addressed to the bishops or to the faithful is addressed to men of goodwill. And then in conversation with his secretary, Msgr Capovilla, and one afternoon in conversation with Cardinal Tardini, the Vatican Secretary of State, the notion of a council came into his mind. I think it may have germinated as a seed before that, but it burst forth into a kind of flower, and he said, a council, a council. And Monsignor Tardini was a little taken aback, but faithful, and he said, ah, yes, a council. Then Pope John took the idea to the resident cardinals there in Rome. And there is a plaque in one of the rooms in the monastery, Benedictine monastery, next to St. Paul's outside the walls, that describes how he made the announcement, and they were struck dumb with admiration. And it may or may not have been admiration. Well, obviously what the Pope wanted, the Pope was going to get. If he wanted a council, he was going to have a council. But also, obviously, it was important for the council not to get out of hand.
Let me stop you at this point, Dr. Outler. The title of our program this week is An Unexpected Thing.
This is right.
And from what you have said, this is aptly titled because this was unexpected and a total surprise even to the Curia.
It was indeed.
Let me ask Monsignor Rehkemper at this point, before we continue with the discussion, what was the reaction in the Catholic world, among the hierarchy, among the lay people, among the theologians, when the council was announced? Was it totally unexpected? Had there been any hint of it, or did it just drop as a bomb?
Well, I think it was a bomb, and it was distinctively John the 23rd's bomb. I don't think many of us had ever even thought of a council happening again, not in the near future anyway. Because everything had been done, you know, by Rome, by the various offices and congregations in Rome. And So I think that we were all surprised. We really didn't know what to expect. Many questioned why we needed one. Others thought, gee, it's about time that we're having one, you see. So I think there was, first of all, a surprise, and then as it developed and the consultations started to take place, then I believe that certainly the theologians and the churchmen were extremely interested in the preparation for the council and what the council was supposed to accomplish. I would say first surprise and then a gradual interest developing.
Do you think there was an understanding of what a council was?
Well, there was only one man in Rome who had been alive when the First Vatican Council adjourned in 1870. But yes, they knew what a council was. These men are good church historians. But they also knew that a council under these circumstances could be genuinely disruptive. And they wanted to make sure that if they had a council, it would be a council under control. It would be a council that would express the developing convictions and policy of the Roman Curia.
They being the Curia, you...
Yes, exactly. That is to say, the cardinals in Rome, the officials of the congregations, and for that matter, their consultants throughout the world. By and large, the notion was to have a council with a minimum of dislocation or a minimum of change. On the other hand, you see, the ecumenical underground recognized that here was a God-given opportunity, and they began to prepare for it in their way. And this is why when the council met, they had on the one hand these preparatory documents which the council was expected to accept and approve, and it might have been a council that lasted for one term or 2 terms at most. And so what was genuinely unexpected is that the council that was designed to please the Pope and to move the Roman Catholic Church forward by a little bit turned into a great ecumenical event and a landmark in modern church history.
What was the significance, if any, of the fact that John chose the term ecumenical council and used the word ecumenical, knowing full well that it was an ambiguous term?
Well, actually, a council of all of the bishops of the Church of Rome with the Pope is an ecumenical council, technically. So that he was using a term in a proper technical sense. What was new was the fact of observers there. Remember that the World Council of Churches had invited the Roman Catholic Church to send observers to New Delhi in 1961. We hadn't actually expected them to respond favorably. But Pope John said, why not? And sent a small group of very gracious people to the assembly, and we didn't know what to do with them. We had no precedence on that score, and in a certain sense, we sort of walled them off from the actual procedures of the assembly itself. Then when the Vatican Council was called, Cardinal Bea and Monsignor Willebrands proposed to the Pope that non-Roman Catholic observers be brought to this council. And the Pope thought this was a great idea, but again, no precedence, no protocol, and no way of knowing what was going to happen.
How were you personally chosen to be an observer?
Well, that's a little odd, too. Again, the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity did not know the various Protestant groups. They only could see these large family gatherings, the Lutheran World Alliance or the Presbyterian World Alliance or the World Methodist Conference. And they decided that the safest way would be to invite these world bodies to choose their delegates. They said, for example, to the Lutherans, you have 4 seats in the Observer's Tribune. To the Anglicans, you have 4. And to the Reformed, you have 4. To the Methodists, and they just looked at the statistics, you have 3. Well, that posed the question whom to send. The obvious answer was the president of the World Methodist Council in 1962, which was Bishop Corson, and that also meant that the ex-president, the British president, should be the second. That left a 3rd seat, and so for that they looked around to find a professor with a historical orientation who could understand Latin fairly well. And that's how I got tapped for the most exciting assignment in my life.
I was present for the opening of that council, and I will testify that the observers had the best seats in the house.
This is so.
Right around the main altar.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Under a huge statue of St. Longinus, and so we called ourselves the Brotherhood of St. Longinus.
How many observers were there?
At the beginning, there were 54 designated. That then grew up to a working group of 68. At the last session, there were 92. But since some of the official observers, or delegated observers, weren't there all the time, substitutes were run in and out, so that there must have been 500 people in and out of St. Peter's in the course of the 4 sessions.
Why don't you tell us about the opening of the council?
Well, it was the greatest experience of my life, of course. I'd never been to Rome previously. That was my first trip there. The day started with rain. I remember that very clearly because I got up very early to try to get to St. Peter's in order to get into my place, which was a subterfuge, by the way, in order to get there and to be able to see what was going on. But by the time the procession started, the sun was out. It was a beautiful beginning of the council.
Yeah.
And it was just a tremendous sight to see St. Peter's Basilica filled with bishops with their white copes and their white mitres, and then of course the Protestant observers there with their respective garb, and then I think they had some kings there, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh,
so it was
diplomatic corps.
a beautiful sight, and I will never forget it.
It's interesting to me that, in retrospect, some people are tempted to, from an ecumenical point of view, say that the document on ecumenism and on non-Christian religions were the significant documents, but wouldn't it be accurate to say that every document that was promulgated as a result of the council had an impact upon the ecumenical situation?
Oh yes, and it would take too much time to go through each one, but it is the case. For example, the council was set by the general plan to approve a set of quite conservative and quite traditional documents. The document on Revelation, for example, had the title of the 2 sources of revelation, Scripture and tradition. The document on the church was straight, old-fashioned Vatican I ecclesiology. And if that had happened, it would have been simply an event within the Roman Catholic Church, and we would have observed that event and not have been involved in it significantly. But when the Constitution on the liturgy came up, immediately a debate sprang up, and very shortly it was clear that the council was divided on this point. And you may know the story of how the vote on the Constitution came out in such a way that they could not defeat it, and they could not get rid of it. The proposal had been, you do not wish to remove this from consideration, do you? And the bishops had in effect voted that they did not want to suspend this from discussion. It came to be an impasse, and Pope John XXIII withdrew the document from consideration in the council. This was in itself, you see, an event that changed the character of the council. He appointed a new commission, and this new commission was itself very much more representative. Well, that Constitution and the absolute classic of the whole council was the Constitution on the Church, the Constitution on Revelation, the Decree on Ecumenism, the Declaration on Religious Liberty. Every one of those went through a process of debate, change, discussion, and in every case the observers were consulted and had a genuine contribution to make, particularly to the Decree on Ecumenism. I could tell you all sorts of stories about the background of each one of those documents, almost chapter by chapter, because Gus Weigel took the observers and helped us to follow the documentation. It was a remarkable experience.
And there's one document not even thought of which developed during the course of the council was the Church in the World.
That's right. See, what happened was that at the end of the first session, it was clear that the council was at an impasse. I think that if something hadn't been done, it might have simply adjourned without any accomplishments. Early in December, just before it was scheduled to adjourn, two cardinals, the Cardinal of Milan, the Cardinal of Brussels, got up on the council floor and reviewed the work of the first session and then laid out a program of the council and its agenda. By the second session, the Cardinal of Milan was the new Pope, Paul VI. And the Cardinal of Brussels, Cardinal Sunens, was one of the four new moderators. And this meant that their program had been adopted, and one point in that program was that the council should address itself to the contemporary situation. And so they almost invented a new category for conciliar documents. It was a constitution, but not a regular constitution. It was more than a decree. So what could they call it? A pastoral constitution on the church and the modern world.
I've heard it said that there were really two councils, the Johannine Council and the Pauline Council. Is this true? Was there that much difference between that first session and the subsequent ones?
Well, yes, in the nature of the case, each papacy sets its own mark on the life and work of the church, and that's what you take for granted. But I would urge that there was very much more continuity between the Johannine Council and the three sessions of the Pauline Council. And I would insist, and this is one of the places where I stand apart a little from other historians of that council, I would insist that Paul VI really made Vatican II come off. When the first session adjourned, it was at an impasse. Scarcely, the people in the council scarcely knew where to turn. The Americans were not accustomed to genuine involvement in a council like that, and the missionary bishops had just begun to get their sense of belonging to the conciliar process. if the new pope had given the slightest signal of indifference or of only moderate interest, the second session would have been perfunctory and might very well have been the end of the council. Paul VI was determined that the council that John the 23rd had called would continue, and would continue in the spirit that John the 23rd had loosed abroad in the world, and that there would be a full development of every one of the main issues that had been raised in the first session of the council, and he succeeded. You must give Paul VI credit for Vatican II and for its most significant distinctive harvest.
Let me ask you about another man whose name hasn't been mentioned yet, and that's Cardinal Bea, whose role in the council and subsequent to the council I think was particularly significant with regard to ecumenism. Can you tell us a little bit about his role and the development of the Secretariat?
Yes. You see, Rome had no way of dealing with the non-Roman Catholic world. The Holy Office was scarcely the appropriate organ for dealing with the rest of us. And one of the difficulties before Vatican II was that we had no access to Rome. It is the case that Pius XI received a delegation of people in 1927, but it was just polite, and he told them that there was a simpler answer to the problem of Christian disunity than the one they were struggling with. But we had no way of getting to Rome, or of Rome communicating with us. What Bea did was to suggest to John the 23rd that if he had a secretariat, which is not a congregation, and which is an ad hoc arrangement, a secretariat for the promotion of Christian unity, that this would be a medium of communication between Rome and the non-Roman Christian communities. And Bea's work was this business of managing this relay point between the papacy on the one hand and the scattered and disorganized Protestant Orthodox world on the other. It was a real genius, and he drew a small group of people around him, many of whom had been interested in this ecumenical underground beforehand, and set them to work, and with a very small staff, he accomplished a miracle.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to ask you to share with us your opinion on the most significant actions of the Council on the ecumenical movement.
Well, first, it was the reflection within the Roman Catholic community itself on the nature of the Church. The great classical document of that council is the Constitution on the Church. And there, instead of portraying the traditional concept of the Roman Church institutionally, they reordered the whole ecclesiological picture and started with the vision of the people of God. And that in itself had an ecumenical horizon. Then in the chapter on the hierarchy, they established the notion of collegiality of the bishops of the world as colleagues with the Pope and with each other, which also means that ecumenically Non-Roman Catholics can deal with diocesan bishops and with regional conferences of bishops. And this was a great achievement. And then the decree on ecumenism began with the notion that the Roman Church has the fullness of the Church in and of herself. And it literally said that the Roman Catholic Church is the Church. In the discussions over the months, that was changed from the Roman Catholic Church is the Church to the Roman Catholic Church subsists in and is in effect an integral part of the full community of God's people. That was not a concession. They were not watering down their convictions. They were only opening up the vision of the fullness of the Christian community. And that becomes the theological hinge on which all of the other things could turn. A fourth thing, their description of the Protestant communities in the early drafts of the document on ecumenism had been taken out of somebody's encyclopedia, were perfectly awful. And we pointed that out to them, and instead of doing it themselves, they came back and said, could you write a description of the Protestant communities that you would understand and that we could live with? And we said we could try, and we did. And the text of the decree on ecumenism has in it materials supplied by the Protestant observers as to how they see themselves and how they want the Roman Catholic Church to see them.
We have run out of time. We're again at a place that takes us directly into our third discussion on the next program, where we talk about the fact that the Vatican Council laid out, in Dr. Outler's words from an earlier time, an agenda for a generation. We thank our guests for being with us, and we hope that you will return for the program, An Agenda for a Generation.